Hello everybody, it's Darren here from Republic of Play, and today we're going to be taking another extended look at the Imperator ROME 1.2 Cicero beta, which is coming out a little bit later in September. Now I covered this on the channel about 3 weeks ago, as there was a ton of stuff to cover. Huge overhauls to the game, major game-changing things to do with buildings, pops, resources. Almost every facet of the game that you interact with as a player was changing in some dramatic way. It really was a huge overhaul, and it's after just getting even bigger. Just the other day, 4 or 5 new major features have been added or reworked already on top of this beta itself. I think the beta is having its 4th update, and no doubt it's going to have a couple more before it even comes out. I had assumed when I made my video that that was pretty much it. There was already a jam-packed amount of stuff in there, and I thought they'd just be kind of balancing it and kind of further developing their AI to use it. But I was wrong. They're after adding 3 or 4 or 5 even that I have written down more things to the game, which we're going to go through in this video. So if you're unfamiliar with the 1.2 Cicero beta, you can download it yourself and check it out to play on Steam if you own the game. And it is experimental, it's a work in progress. Don't expect to have long campaigns with it, but it is interesting to at least check out the mechanics that are at play. If you don't have the time to do that, or if you don't own the game, that's what I'm here for, and we're going to take a look at some of these new features now. Before we get into it, I thought we should just at least recap for those who don't want to watch my other video or haven't seen it or have forgotten what's been changed already. Let's just briefly go through some of the major things that have changed already. The first one is how loyalty and power is reworked for characters. I won't go too much into it, like I said, it's all in this other video, but essentially power base is going to be something that a character accrues. The more power they have and the lower their loyalty, the bigger risk they pose in a civil war. Obviously as a ruler here, it doesn't really matter, but for other characters it does. So you don't want your characters getting a bit too powerful, and especially if their loyalty drops, they're going to raise a serious army and be a real big threat. The biggest change is probably the fact that mana has now been removed, largely speaking, or at least being condensed into one thing. There used to be 4 mana resources up here, and now there's just the political influence. Political influence is gained based on the loyalty of all the people that are working in your offices. So the 8 people that work in your government, how loyal they are is how much political influence you're going to gain, and you can then use that to develop provinces, to do diplomacy, to enact laws, and things like that. A much better system. It rewards character interaction. It feels very good to use as well. Military experience is now a new thing. It kind of replaced the military power concept before, but essentially it's a one-to-one relation with how you use your armies in the game now. Now, if you drill your armies, which we can't do right now just because I have them on low maintenance, but if we were to drill our armies, they will gain experience, and the more experience our armies gain, the more they contribute to the military experience income. Then we use that to get military traditions. So again, a much more organic way and an easier to understand relation between the military traditions and your actual military. You can either be training your armies or actually fighting battles, and doing that is going to make them better. There's now 15 buildings in the game, a huge amount of buildings which we'll touch on a little bit later. Migration, assimilation, and conversions of pops will now happen organically, and they happen over time. So if we check a more interesting place here, we can see that this is going to happen over time, this is going to happen over time, and this is going to happen over time. So they're going to promote, they're going to migrate, they're going to change their religion, and they're going to change their culture all separately, all over time. Things happen much more organically, and they do generally take longer to happen as well. There's now reworks to fabricating claims. If you want to fabricate a claim, it's going to take some time. This is pretty interesting because now when a country like Phrygia breaks up and breaks apart, you can't just instantly declare war on one of its smaller counterparts. I mean, you could, I guess, for a big stability hit. But if this kind of claim fabrication thing gives them a lot more time to find allies, to figure themselves out before you just take them on. Speaking of stability, stability is now changed as well to be a more flexible bar, reaching from 0 to 100, always trying to settle in somewhere in the middle. So that's just, again, much better than the 1, 2, 3 kind of situation we had before. And I could go on, there's many other minor improvements like holdings, character interactions, and things like that. But let's get to the meat and potatoes of today's video, which is the 5 new features that they've added since the previous 1.2 update. So this is now 1.2 0.4, I guess we could call it, because they're calling it the 4th update to the beta. So now the main thing that we can take a look at is how settlements have changed. All of these little regions here, which we're now going to call settlements from now on, used to be called cities. But they're now settlements, I think, effectively. Settlements are blank regions with a few pops in them, and now cities are the areas that are more densely populated, and they have a 3D visualization on the map of who lives there. Settlements don't. Even though there is people living in Neapoli, Turkey, there's actually no visual representation of that. That's a little bit of a sticking point for me. I think it should have a little house, one or two little buildings. I think would look kind of nice. Having it be completely empty, I think, is a bit strange. But it is just to kind of visually identify the fact that these are settlements and these are cities. There's also something funky going on with the cities where they're just building out in squares now. I don't know why it's doing that either, but there you go. So a settlement can actually be upgraded into a city. So you can upgrade any settlement you want into a city. For instance, Tafros has really been my experimental city from the beginning of the game. We started with just 5 pops here. I founded a city. You can found a city with any number of pops in it, I think. Let's just double check that, right? There's only 8 here. Yeah, you just need the money and political influence to do it. So you can found a city, and that's going to give you more room to grow more pops, and then you can build more buildings. So an actual settlement has a different set of buildings than a city does. So a settlement is going to have buildings that largely increase the population capacity and then specialize one way or the other. You can only build one in a settlement ever, one of any type. You can't build more than one building. And you can't upgrade that building to have multiple of the same. It's really just one, no matter what. So for instance, in this particular settlement here, I have provincial legation at the moment, which is going to give us pop migration speed and pop assimilation speed. So if there is pops migrating here, they're going to migrate in a little bit faster. That being said, I don't think there's really any reason people would migrate here, so it's kind of a useless building at the moment. The other ones you can do are slave estates, mines, farming settlements, tribal settlements, and so on. Mines, I believe, require you to have stone, base metals, or some sort of resource to actually be built and exploited. And farms are the same. They require some sort of food good, I suppose you could call it, in order to build a farming settlement. And that's then going to provide food for your province. But we'll talk about food a little bit later. So that's some of the new buildings that have come and arrived with this whole new settlement structure. So that's pretty much settlements done in a nutshell. They have lower pop counts, they have slower pop growth, they have less chance of having people migrate towards them because they're settlements. They are just really there to support the cities in a province. But unlike other kind of strategy games, you can have as many cities as you want. If you wanted, you could upgrade all of these to cities, I believe. It's just you'd be hurting for food then, probably, because they can't really produce as much food if you don't. So, if we take another look at this city, then we can take a look at the buildings that are involved here. So the only crossover building, I think, is the fortress. So you can build a fortress regardless if it's a settlement or if it's a city. And by the way, the one up from a city is called a metropolis. Now, I should preface this building art, all of this artwork, that is done, I believe, by a YouTuber and modder, I guess. I say I guess because I don't know if he wants to be considered a modder or a YouTuber, but he is both, I suppose. And that's Long Game Short, I think, who's done the icons here. And I've basically just stolen them for my own mod, which isn't public, it's just for the video, really. Just so there's not as much of this everywhere. Everything is just currently that missing icon. So I've just to make it look nicer, these are placeholder icons, okay? Just be aware of that. The other thing then I've added myself is the city icon here to the left of the city name. The reason I've done that is I've just made my own variation of a settlement to city to metropolis icon, again, just for the video. And then I've added my own food icon, which is just a combination of icons from resources, essentially. So that's, if you're just wondering what the art is all about, that's all placeholder. Everything is really subject to change at this point. So where were we? We were talking about metropolises. So I haven't actually made a metropolis yet, but all we know that they do anyway is they increase the amount of population you can have. So kind of it really extends it. You can't build it until you have at least 80 pops. So I think my biggest city at the moment is over here. There's 48 in it. So if we eventually get 80, then we can upgrade to a metropolis. It takes quite a long time, and then it costs quite a lot of money as well. It costs about 700 gold for me here before we could do it. And it has to be the capital. A metropolis has to be the capital of the province. So I haven't actually seen one in the game yet, but just from reading what they've talked about, what metropolises do, it's essentially just this increase to the amount of pops that you can have, and there's some extra benefits. You do not get any buildings from it or anything special like that. Whereas if you change from a settlement into a city, your settlement buildings get destroyed and it becomes a city, a blank slate city that you can then build. Unless it was a fort will carry over. So yeah, so that's essentially how that's working right now. Based on the amount of pops, still is how many buildings then you can build, but it's a bit more flexible now. And then you can also do the thing that was introduced in the 1.1 update, I think, which is if you wanted, you could promote infrastructure spending, pay your 90 influence, and then just get an extra building slot. So you could keep doing that on repeat forever, and it lasts forever as well. And I don't think there's any cap to it. So if you really want to just hammer your buildings home, and you had the money to do it, and you had the influence to do it, you can play tall in that regard, where you can just keep investing into your own cities and your own capitals and whatever else you might want to do. All right, so that's our settlement to cities to metropolises, and that's kind of how that works. Let's take a look at how some of these new buildings have changed. So there is 15 buildings in a city that you can build. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on here. So let's just go through them, right? We have the time to do it. There's a training camp for manpower. There's a fortress for fort levels. There's barracks for supply and defense. Foundries for recruitment and starting experience. Marketplaces to exploit your commerce value. Tax offices to exploit your tax income. Courts of law to increase your loyalty of the province. Now this is where we start getting really interesting. An academy, which will increase your research and your pop promotion speed. So this is going to be really something great for the citizens, because it's a percentage to research. If you don't have any research, no citizens, not a good one to build. If you do, very good one to build. Then we have a granary, which will give you food capacity of 100, and we'll touch on food pretty soon. Then we have a library, which is going to give you citizen happiness and citizen ideal fraction. We'll talk about that again in a moment. So again, these two buildings here, the academy and the library, you know, it's very like education buildings, I suppose you could say. They're going to be dealing with research and increasing how happy your citizens are going to be, because those are your most affluent pops. Then we have a forum. That's going to be almost the same as a library, but just for the freemen. So it's going to increase the freemen happiness and the freeman ideal fraction. We'll talk about ideal fraction soon. Workshop, again, going to be the next one down. That's for slaves. So slave output and slave happiness. So having something like a workshop combined with a tax office means you're getting more out of your slaves, and then that income is then being modified. So slaves give tax, and then you're modifying your tax. Whereas with something like the library, you build a library and then you get an academy. So now you're getting happier citizens that also give you more research. So that's kind of how you can double off those things. Then we have kind of the conversion buildings. We have a temple, which is going to give you religious happiness to the state in this province or in the city. And then we have pop conversion speed. So if pops are converting their religion here, they're going to do it a bit faster. And that's not a modifier. That's a hard number. Then we have a theater, which is going to do pretty much the same, but just for culture. And then an aqueduct, which is going to increase your maximum population capacity by 4, and also increase the migration attraction by 0.25. So those are the buildings. It's 15 buildings, quite a lot, and I really like the idea of messing with this and adding more with mods or something in the future. Something I wanted to point out actually before I forget is if we take a look again at a city or a settlement, so the smallest of the run, it's quite interesting that a mine and a farm is actually requires some resources. Now, previously in modding, it was actually impossible for a building to have a requirement for a resource. At least from what I understand. Maybe that's wrong, but no mod had done it anyway, and I couldn't figure out how to do it after a long time spent with it. Now we've got the framework in there to actually have buildings that require different resources. I don't know if after you build it, if you lost the resource, would you then lose the chance of building the building? We'll have to see. I have to kind of look into that a bit more. As far as I know right now, you can only build a building if you're making the trade good in that place, not importing it into the province. Importing it into the province is different, but if we can do a check for what we're actually producing locally, maybe we can do a check for what we're importing provincially as well, and that would be really great. Because I think, without going off on a big tangent, I really, really strongly believe, or at least want to test it out, my theory that having buildings tied to trade goods and only operate when you have those trade goods present would really be an amazing touch to the game. I think you should be able to build a building that requires numerous trade goods to be able to just even build it, and then if you have those trade goods, it has a benefit, right? Let's say your building operates at 50%. It operates at 50% capacity if you lost your trade goods. So it doesn't go offline maybe completely because you were able to initially build it, but if you have the goods still present, it's like a 200% effector or something like that, something good, where it really, really matters if you keep those resources. I would love that. We'll expand on that later, maybe in a different video. I don't know anyone who doesn't agree with that, to be honest. Most people think that sounds fun. And I think that would be kind of cool to also tie trade to your buildings, and trade is tied to diplomacy. So, I think it just would tie everything together. And now that pops are more closely related to buildings, it's just even better. So I'll maybe invest in making a mod at some point for all of that. Anyway, that was my tangent. I'm after losing my place now a little bit. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, we're talking about the different buildings and that mine and stuff. Yeah. So that's pretty much the buildings covered. Now, we mentioned ideal fraction a few times, right? Pop promotion speed, pop ideal fraction, citizen ideal fraction, whatever the individual pop might be. So let's open up the next major change, which is how pops kind of change and assimilate and move over time. So we'll open up the pop screen here. I've actually slightly modded this screen. If you open it up in the game yourself, it'll be a little bit more cluttered. And I've added in some of the icons, like I said myself. So I'm going to look at Tafros. Tafros, in this little playthrough I had, this wasn't really a serious playthrough. We were kind of streaming it. And my goal was to remove as many tribesmen as I could from this particular city. And I was just trying to test out the mechanics. Like, can I remove all these tribesmen? Can I get citizens to be more than free men? Can I really figure out the system? And I did. It didn't feel like I exactly knew what I was doing, but I got the result I was trying to aim for, so that was good. But Tafros was my kind of offline project then. When I was not streaming, I said, okay, this was previously a settlement. I made it the province capital. I then made it a city, and then I started investing heavily into getting conversions up and running and things there. Because this used to be Scythian territory, and culturally it still very much is Scythian, and I couldn't figure out, like, why is it taking so long to convert the culture? And Hellenism is kind of taking root there now, but it took a very long time to get to that point. So let's look at how pops change over time and why it's happening at the rate it is here. So in this population of Tafros screen, we can see the basic breakdown here of culture, religion, and classes. We'll ignore what's up on top just for now. So in culture, we have 80%. I actually, for the video, I got rid of a couple pops just so we had 10, so we could see a very nice even amount of percentages, just so it's just easier to read. So we have 80% Scythian and 20% Hellenistic. And then this is the assimilation kind of bar, this is the conversion bar, and this is the promotion bar. So if someone is assimilating, we see it there. If someone's converting, we see it here, and so on. And the type of pop that's doing it is listed here. So this is a tribesman by its icon. It's heptatic and it's Scythian, but it's not changing. It actually says right at the top, the assimilation of a heptatic Scythian tribesman to Bosporan is currently stalled. And that's because the tribesman assimilating is getting a 0.50, right? So that would take quite a long time even by itself, but then it's been hindered by not having the dominant religion correct, not having the dominant culture, our culture, not having a lot of unrest, having Hellenistic heritage, which is our actual empire modifier, Hellenistic heritage. So that's just something we are kind of born with. And then having tyranny isn't affecting it, and then not Hellenic religion. So the religion aspect is holding us back 43% because it's not the dominant religion, and not Hellenic religion of this particular pop who wants to move isn't the correct religion, or who wants to culturally assimilate is not the correct religion. So the interesting thing here, that the main takeaway of all this rambling, is that religion essentially kind of comes first. When you want to change culture, if you're not the right religion, that's playing an effect right from the onset, whereas it's not really as true the other way around. It is, to an extent. This says not Bosporan culture, which is minus 20%, but this is minus 33% for having the wrong religion. So it's really very much the case where you want to instill your religion on people first, and then culturally they'll kind of assimilate after that. So in this particular place, we are still stalled for culture. So culture's just not moving, and we've had this place for a long time. But we are moving religion now at this rate. 1.18% is what we're increasing every time. So 1.18%, we're at 50%, so it's going to take until the year 513. So 3 more years, and we'll convert another one. Now, once we get the Hellenism over the threshold to be the dominant, which is just one more pop away, then it'll be 50-50, and I assume that might count as dominant. If not, it'll be 60-40, right? The other way around. Once that happens, then the culture will start triggering, because it won't say that the dominant culture is wrong, or sorry, that the dominant religion is wrong. You get your religion on point first, and then this bar will start shooting up. So once you pass that dominant threshold, then it's kind of like a snowball effect. Then the culture will start moving and moving and moving, and then when it becomes your dominant culture and there's only 50% non-culture left, then it starts speeding up even more. So I think it's a really interesting system, because it took me a while to figure it out. Just took me a while to figure out what was happening. It's not that complicated. But then once I did figure that out, I decided, okay, well, what we need to do then is to just build temples, because temples are going to be all about the conversion speed. We're also converting them with the religion policy here, and that's just going to increase the conversion speed. It doesn't do the random, like, oh, we'll pick one every month out of 10% or something to just convert. It doesn't do that anymore. It just speeds up that actual conversion speed. So this, how fast this is going, you can see that religious conversion is the second thing down in this tooltip, and that's what's converting it. And we're still being held back by a lot of stuff, but it's still giving us 1.18%. When really we could be, if we had none of these negative modifiers, we could be up to about 17%. So we could be flying, you know, a pop converted every few months, essentially. But it's just those things are hindering us back. So I played with it for a while, and it took me a while to kind of understand it. But I think in terms of how it operates and how it kind of feels to use, I think it's really good. Because you look at an area and it's like, well, it's not even converting. Like you just have people that aren't even converting. And by the way, where it starts to get really granular is we are looking at just one city. Now, we are obviously speeding up the conversion through the policy in the entire province, but those buildings that I built are only applicable to this city. Because you might remember, like I said, the settlements are not going to have the ability to have buildings like temples and things like that. So what you might end up having to do if you really want to get the rest of the province quickly is you can enact a policy called centralized population, which will pull as many pops as it can out of these regions into the capital, convert them, and then we could decentralize and, for lack of a better term, shit them back out. I'm sure there is a better term, but you get the idea. So yeah, so that's kind of how the pop conversion stuff works. And it's the same for promotion. Promotion's not nearly as bad because it doesn't really factor in whether or not they are going to be culture or religion. But class promotion is basically based on something called the optimal ratio. And this is where we saw that stuff to do with fraction come in. I really don't like seeing stuff like this because it really put me off at first, where it was like, oh, you need the optimal ideal fraction, which will give you the optimal ratio. And I was kind of thinking, like, you know, for me, I wouldn't care if all this stuff was just hidden behind the scenes and it was happening, but I can understand the argument that people would want to see it. So let's explain how it's working. So up in the top, we have our citizens, our freemen, tribesmen, and slaves. So here's the number of pop, right? So 2 citizens, that accounts for 20% of the current ratio in our city. And our optimal ratio that we're aiming towards is 20%. Now, what determines that optimal ratio? Well, let's just take a look at a different city very quickly with a bit more flexibility on the numbers. So we have 48 pops here, we have 22 citizens, and 45.8 is our current ratio. No one is promoting or demoting or anything like that. There's no change going on because we've just balanced it the way it needs to be. We have 45%, we have 25% of our freemen. I don't know if this is being clear, but hopefully it is. So essentially, citizens and freemen both have a number called the optimal ratio. And the optimal ratio is affected by the types of buildings you have. So we've got where is it? Here, the library, which is going to increase the ideal fraction. it actually just gives you 4. Each one gives you 4, and that's why totally it gives us 20%. So basically, this optimal ratio is coming from the fact that we have 5 libraries, right? And we can see the base amount, just by standard definition, is like, oh, 20% of our population will be citizens here. That's just the way it's going to work itself out. Now, they have to go through the conversion process. It won't be instant. It's not like you can dump in 100 slaves and then the next day, you know, you've got that 20% optimal ratio. 20% of them just became citizens. It still takes time, and that time is based on your population promotion speed, and that's based on a bunch of things to do with your buildings. It's to do with even, I think, trade goods. It's to do with the capital or not, and a bunch of things. So we have a 45% because I've been trying to bump it up as much as I can by building as many libraries as I can, and also trying to have a fort and an academy and an aqueduct. With only 8 buildings, the best I could do was get 5 libraries, which has given us 20%, and getting an extra 20%, you know, it means that effectively we get about 8 more pops or something here. We're allowed to have 22 citizens here. We get to have 22 citizens here. And then when we're done, well, we always need to maintain that ratio, but we could maybe get rid of some other buildings later, or when we start to grow a bit more, we could then exploit them more by building more academies to get more research from them. So basically, this is a place that's going to be heavily getting a lot of commerce value because there's so many citizens here. There's also a port here, so it would make sense to build a lot of marketplaces and to build a lot of academies and try to bump that number up as much as possible. So it's really a haven for citizens, the way we've spec'd out the city. And if we started deleting all the libraries, this number would fall down. The optimal ratio would fall down. We'd suddenly be over the ratio with our current ratio, and then they'd start depromoting into freemen, or even depromoting into slaves, or they would migrate away to somewhere that has good migration attraction. So that's really the last thing to look at then, in terms of this pop moving about screen, is the migration attraction. So here, for instance, this is something that I still fully don't understand, so take this stuff with a bit of a grain of salt. So at the moment, you can see in Tafros our current changes. This is what our pop is growing. Our next pop is going to be Heptatic Scythian. Now, how it judges what your pop should be, according to Johan, I tweeted at him, he just said it's random. So the class that comes next, you could get a tribesman, you could get a slave, you could get anything. But I think what culture you get and what religion you get is going to be based on the dominant at the time. I think that's the case anyway. But you could get a random type, because you may have noticed that tribesmen and slaves don't actually have an optimal ratio, at least not a visible one. And this is something, again, which I'm not just fully able to understand. They don't have a visible ratio. Now, I kind of scripted in a quick mod to make it visible, because they do have a number that represents their optimal, but it's 0. And I was like, oh, maybe my mod is just wrong. It's displaying just null information. But it wasn't, because there's actually a law that says tyrant kings that allows you to change your slave ideal fraction. And the ideal fraction is your optimal ratio. You're adding 10% of a fraction to the ratio. I think it's a stupid way to put it. Sorry, stupid might sound a bit harsh. I think you should just call it ideal ratio 10%. I think everybody would get it. Why it's called ideal fraction, the other one's called optimal ratio, I don't know. But that's just the way it is. So if you enable tyrant kings with this particular government, it never appears, but if with my mod I could see, then it went up to 10%, and suddenly then slaves, there was always in every single city going to be, it would try to give at least 1 in 10 pops were going to be slaves, you know, that were there at the time. So there is ways to affect it. Now, tribesmen are always 0, but you can still grow tribesmen because it can be random. But those ones are going to essentially try to become, they're going to try to filter in and become something else. Now, the thing that really puzzled me with this is we have 4 slaves and 2 tribesmen, and the one that's changing here was a slave into a freeman. And I just thought, why isn't it a tribesman into a freeman? Like, why is it a slave? Is it because there's more of them? It could just be the case that there's more, but I'm pretty sure there's edge cases where I've seen it where there isn't more, and they convert down or convert in. So there's just a little bit of stuff where I'm just a tiny bit unsure, but we're talking extremely micro here anyway. I think most of the time when you've got a normal sized empire, you won't really be that bogged down in this the way we're going through it right now. But I was specifically trying to play a little bit taller and really get rid of all the tribesmen I had. I saw something very interesting as well over here, where at Yelsa, there's a ton of tribesmen just migrating in here. There's 6 tribesmen just moving, or 5, is it? Yeah, there's 4. So I guess not that crazy. But there's, for some reason, 4 tribesmen coming in here. And some of them are actually coming from bordering other nations because it's within the same province. So yeah, so they're all just filtering into Yelsa because I guess 5 attraction is enough, or it's more than what's there. So we're almost stealing pops from our neighbors just because our attraction value is somewhat higher. Now, why are they all tribesmen? I don't know. Maybe just because that happened to be what was around us. Or maybe there's something else. Because I thought, oh, what if it's the civilization value? 30% is not that high. Or, yeah, 30 value isn't that high. But 55 is our max anyway, in most places. So, a little bit confused on that last bit. But I thought it was still interesting. Even though I don't know the exact extent to which it's working, I thought it was interesting to show you guys. Alright, so let's try to speed up because I'm just getting a little bogged down. So that's the current changes of what's growing, then demoting, and then migrating away, and then migrating in. So you can have a ton of pops migrate in at the same time, and that's based on your migration attraction down at the bottom of the screen here, and that's based on a load of different things. And if the migration attraction, especially of a port town and stuff, is high, then from any other like coastal area, things will just filter into it. So we're just getting a ton of people filtering in at all these different rates. So this place, as I wanted it to, because I was investing heavily into it, is going to explode in growth after about a year, or well, maybe about 2 or 3 years. So we should see it go from 10 pops to about 20 really in the space of 5 years, and then just start really kind of growing and growing from then. And like I said, once we hit the tipping point in religion, which will hit even faster because there's Hellenic pops coming in, and then everything will just kind of snowball, and this will really become a hub of Bosporan Hellenism and culture, which should be good. And we'll start making a lot of money here. So that's kind of how the pop system works. So hopefully you can just see from that, it's way more organic, way more natural, easy to kind of, I don't think it's easy to follow, but it's easy to understand at a meta level, like why things are moving around. If you have a place with ports that has buildings and infrastructure, they tend to just get more pops and pull people towards them and convert people and stuff like that. If you don't develop your towns, for instance, like when I first built here, I only built culture changing buildings. I was like, yeah, I want to change the culture, but the culture wasn't changing no matter the building I built, because we were negative 100%. We were negative 100%, just stalling for assimilation. And that's why I had it for about 5 years, and I was thinking, why is nobody changing there? And it's like, oh, like we're just, the negatives are just so high that it can't even assimilate one. So once I figured that out, it was kind of fun and pretty cool to understand like what we got to do to kind of edge our way in. So we spread our faith, and then we get them culturally on our side. And then the other way of doing it is just making it a really attractive place for migration. And that way we'll just pull in a lot of our own religion, our own kind of culture, and kind of beat them to it that way, So it's kind of interesting the way you can do that. A lot more organic and natural, like I said. And then it just gets a little bit more complicated when we have a city like this that's pulling in pops without us even really wanting it to. And you could imagine that maybe if we were next to a really big popular empire or whatever, a big infrastructure of a city, we'd be losing pops to it, and you have to try and combat that. So I just find that interesting, I just found that interesting. Now, in one of my latest wars, we'll talk about food now. I waged war down here on Byzantium, and we won pretty easily. And I noticed that I have one city out here, which is in its own province, so just one city on its own, and it's losing food. And I was thinking, damn, what do we do to get this food up? So let's discuss what food is really quickly. Every city contributes to food, so we'll just check out a city up here. Right, so the province capital is going to have the sum total of the goods that come in. So it's a bit of it's not really producing all this. This is like the province capital, so that's why the food is so high here. But in a regular city, let's take this is a city, for instance. A regular city is going to be losing food, typically. And then the surrounding ones are going to be providing food. Then if you build a farming settlement on top of that, you get a lot of food out of it. And you only really need 1 or 2 to sustain a pretty big city. So that's kind of food in a nutshell. Now, when food grows, or when you get a lot of food, you might see down the bottom of this tooltip, it says the population of this province consume 400 every 12 months. The effects from having 36 months of food stored is that your population growth is going to increase, and your fort defense is going to increase. So having reached the maximum amount of food, and just having a surplus of food all the time builds up and up and up. I think it does level off at 36 months, I believe. And it gives us that 0.15. So having a full storage of food is going to give us 0.15% increase to goods. And then having different trade goods like grain. So grain, for instance, actually gives us a food modifier of 10%. And then for every bit of grain after that, we have 5 extra food income. So the problem down here for me was, okay, we don't own any of these surrounding settlements, so we can't build farming settlements to sustain this city. We have 27 pops here. It's quite a lot, and it's going down at the moment. And when this reaches 0, when we burn through our food storage, then we're going to start dropping pops pretty quickly, and they're going to start dying off from starvation. And I think it actually kills off all the pops it can in one go until you reach stability. So it's not that you'll just starve one out in 1 year and then another out. You'll actually starve like 5 out until you reach that threshold where you're actually gaining food again. So it's quite, I guess, in a way realistic. It's like they just starved, like the ones you weren't feeding died in a way. So what do you do then in a situation like this? Maybe you're a city-state. This Chalcedon was literally like, Chalcedon was just a state on its own. So how were they sustaining themselves like this? I don't know how the AI was doing it, if they were doing it at all. But what we can do is we can entice business investments and get a local import route of 1. And if we do that twice, which I've actually gone ahead and done, we'll just load that up. Here's one I made earlier. Right. So this is a few years later. Now remember, we had 26 pops. This took so long because, after all, first of all, it takes like 100 influence basically, and you only really gain about a maximum of 2 influence per month, right? That's the max you can get, I think, even if you have everyone at 100% loyalty. So based on that, we did entice business investments, and we did it twice. I don't know if it tells me that. Oh, it just says it here. Yeah, local import routes +2. So I've done it twice, and that's allowed me then to pull in grain and pull in grain again. So we get 3 from the plains, 5 from our surplus of grain, 1 from having this be the province capital, and then a bunch of things is affecting us right now, like bleed them dry. The amount of citizens, freemen, and slaves are then going to be consuming it. So this is a bad policy to have. I didn't even realize that. But we should have, I don't know, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But just for the sake of argument, have that on. And then we should be growing even more food. So we were 5.5, now it's 7.75. And once we reach the max threshold, we'll start growing pops again. But because I let it get to the stage where we did starve, because the other thing was the food capacity was quite low. Now to increase food capacity, you want to be building granaries. Now it wouldn't have made a difference to us anyway, because we were just losing food from the onset. But if we had granaries here, we would have had 100 more food capacity. So that if we get into a situation now, we should build 2 or 3 of these. So we have a surplus of like 400 or 500 food. And then if we lose our grain that's coming from the Seleucid Empire right now, we'd have the time to get it from somewhere else, right, before we start starving. So it's just interesting. I think the food system is quite interesting. I'd kind of almost like to see it be a bit more harsh, to be honest, because it's not that punishing. You have food storage, I think, is quite forgiving. You know, I think you can last years on food storage alone. I don't know if that was necessarily, I'm not saying that the game has to be realistic. I don't know if that was necessarily realistic. Maybe it was with grain and stuff, but I feel like things like, does salt preserve food? We have salt here, so let's check on our province capital, and we'll check here for food. So livestock is giving us 10%, fish, herbalism, etc. Salt isn't. It'd be cool if something like salt, and maybe even if they introduced ice, which was like a resource at the time, and that could like extend, you know, your food capacity, or maybe not the food capacity, but the time before it like rots or something like that. I don't know. I just think in some ways it's quite simple and just easy to stay on top of, but I think it's a really good system even as it is, because I've taken over cities that have had food problems. But once you tend to sort it out, it doesn't seem to get affected too much. Now everything is subject to be balanced at this stage in the game, in this beta at the moment, and as you build and build and build your population up, then things get more complicated. Obviously, if you migrate a lot of people in suddenly, and that's kind of out of your control, suddenly you're consuming way more food. But a lot of my places, like this one for instance, making 20 food, this one's making 30 food. You know, there's no chance like of us starving anytime soon. We'd need so many more pops, and when we get more pops, we can get more out of our trade goods. So I think it needs to be a bit harsher. Anyway, this video has gone on for very long. That's just some of the things that have changed. I think they're really, really, really great additions in general. My biggest gripe with the game at this point really is just how all this information is displayed, and hopefully it can be tidied up. Some of it is being tidied up already, But this screen, with the optimal ratios and stuff, and the different name changes between optimal ratios and ideal fractions, I think those names, to me at least, are just confusing and a little bit obtuse. And I just feel like we should have some arrow connecting to here to indicate like what it's doing. You know, a lot of people, I just don't know if they'll really get it at first without heavy explanation. And this game doesn't really give you a tutorial, right? So those things I think need to be improved just a little bit. UI is just a bit stubborn. Right, starting to rant on now. Thank you very much for watching. By the way, I'm going to be going away in about, I don't know, in a week or so, for about 2 weeks. And I plan on doing a series, a mini series, Let's Play of this. So if you want to see how the game kind of plays over time, and I'll try to make it as interesting as possible, go through some of these new mechanics, and I'll also be noob friendly, so I'll show you how it's being played, but also hopefully play it at a decent speed. If that's something you're interested in, I just thought I'd let you know that's what I'm going to be doing. There should be about 5 episodes, I think, just so everyone can kind of see how things are going. We'll maybe do 100 years and set ourselves like a target. If we were the Busborns, our target would be like, let's get all of the Black Sea, yeah? If there's an empire that you'd like to see for that, let me know in the comments below. I might do the Busborn Kingdom. They're quite fun. I played them differently this time. I played them a bit more expansively next time. But it could be anybody. I really don't mind. We could even do someone really big and huge. It doesn't really bother me. If there's any good ideas out there, we'll go with them. All right, I'm losing my voice. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.